had a first year seminar class where you actually had a power presenting workshop that you recall? A few of you? Okay. We started that a while ago. I got here in 2015. I think it was going about a year before I got here. They had started it, but then I took it over and started that. And then you're supposed to have a public presentation intensive course in your major, right? And then you do a capping project that involves a lot of public presentation. So public presentation skills are one of the most important core skills that we emphasize here at Marist, along with writing, right, and a bunch of other things. So power pitching has a persuasive focus, though. The power presenting workshops and the materials that we usually train the freshmen with are focused on informative speaking, because that's usually what you have to do in college. But power pitching is all about persuasion and being a master persuader. Speaking of master persuaders, Steve Jobs. The people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. It's one of my favorite quotes by him, one of the most famous quotes by him. And I hope that you are one of those people, right? And you have one of those ideas that's going to change the world. Now, the trick is, when you have one of those ideas, you then have to get someone else to believe in your idea as much as you do. Preferably someone else with the money to fund it, right? As did all the tech startups in Silicon Valley.
So before we went on the roadshow, the bankers and Mike and Ed wanted us to have a particular professional look.
We did not know how to pitch. We did not know how to dress. We did not know any part of the process, really.
They asked us to also get a coach who could teach us how to present properly and the physicality of it.
Think of online community like your offline community,
except much bigger. In the next few years, there's going to be 100 million people on the internet.
We didn't understand the communication style, and this was incredibly frustrating to Steph.
Okay, this is from, it's not a documentary, it's really a TV show in the style of a documentary from National Geographic called Valley of the Boom. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but it's pretty entertaining. And it intersperses the show, which is based on a true story, not, you know, a true documentary, with interviews with the actual tech entrepreneurs. So it's pretty cool. But you can see how it is important to know how to pitch, and it is a different style of communication that you might need a little more training in, even if you've had lots of practice doing informative speeches. To have the perfect pitch, your pitch has to be on target and it has to be in tune. And by in tune, I mean in tune with your target audience's psychology. That's a little psychology symbol there. So how do you tune in to your target audience's psychology and develop the perfect pitch that is right on target? Well, we're going to talk about your story, figuring out what your story is, building your story, hopefully, around what your why is in order to move people. We're going to talk about aiming your pitch and the importance of being audience-centered. We're going to talk about planning your pitch, and in that section, we're going to talk about being strategic as well as being clear, because both things are important when you are speaking to persuade. And then finally, we'll talk about delivering your pitch and how to harness anxiety and those sorts of things. Okay, so first, what's your story?
Now, maybe some of you guys have tried to convey your idea and it wasn't adopted, it was rejected, and some other mediocre or average idea was adopted. And the only difference between those two is in the way it was communicated. Because if you communicate an idea in a way that resonates, change will happen, and you can change the world. And the way that ideas are conveyed the most effectively is through story. You know, for thousands of years, illiterate generations would pass on their values and their culture from generation to generation, and they would stay intact. So there's something kind of magical about a story structure that makes it so that when it's assembled, it can be ingested and then recalled by the person who's receiving it. So basically, a story, you get a physical reaction. Your heart can race, your eyes can dilate. You could talk about, oh, I got a chill down my spine, or I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. We actually physically react when someone's telling us a story.
Okay, so humans are hardwired to respond to stories. This is a great TED Talk by Nancy Duarte about the shape of great presentation. She analyzed many of the great presentations of our time, including Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, just many of the great ones, and she found that they all follow a very similar pattern. And the pattern is based in story. And if you've ever watched a TED Talk and it could keep your attention for the entire 30 or 40 minutes, however long it was, they're usually based on a story. And they usually take you through those story, parts of the story from the beginning to the end, and you progress with them in that. So we're going to talk about how to activate that. In order to move people, you have to unlock the limbic system. Cognitive psychology was my cognate, my doctoral program. Super interesting stuff. There's a lot of psychology that goes into communication in general, but then also for persuasion, even more so. And we think rationally in a different part of our brain than we feel emotions. And if you're going to move people, you have to make them feel something. If you're going to motivate them to invest in your idea, you've got to somehow activate their emotional side, which is in the limbic system. The rational side, you're going to have all sorts of things in your business classes about total and target market data and serviceable market and all of those technical terms that you learn about when you develop a business plan. That's the logical side, and that's going to be part of your presentation as well when you pitch. But I'm going to teach you, hopefully, how to weave it into a story that will be compelling to a potential investor. Your story should be based on why. And here's why. If you haven't seen Simon Sinek's inspirational leadership model, I highly recommend that you take a look at it. It is extremely interesting. It's based on a lot of research, psychological and cognitive psychological research. And he talks about how someone won't follow you for what you do, and they won't follow you for how you do it, but they will follow you for why you do something. So you can get in touch with and activate the limbic system by talking about your purpose, your cause, your belief. What is it that motivated you? Why did you decide to develop this idea or this product, whatever it is that you're pitching? Once you get in touch with that, then you can build a story around that and incorporate it into your pitch. Okay. So now aiming your pitch. How do you go about aiming your pitch? Well, you have to be audience-centered, do your research on your audience. If you know anything about your audience, who they're going to be. I'm not sure if you will know who the judges will be in the competition or not ahead of time, but if so, you have an opportunity to do some research. Even if you don't know specifically who they will be, you know the type of people who are usually recruited to judge these competitions potentially, so you can sort of put your empathy skills to work and imagine the things that they might value. It's important to think about that as you begin to build your speech. You have to think about what your audience already knows and what they value in order to be audience-centered when you develop your pitch. So you got to do your research. If you know who you're pitching to, then I highly recommend always, of course, go to their website, check for their mission statement on there first thing, because the mission statement encapsulates their values, their core values. Also, look for the organizational structure, look for who's on their board. All of those things, as much as you can find out about those people, will help you figure out what is it they value, because then you're going to figure out where your story comes into contact with that. Of course, then the annual report is important too. And then, of course, we also have social media. So if you know who you're pitching to, I would recommend looking them up on LinkedIn at the very least. So for this competition, you may not know exactly, but in the future, if you pitch your ideas, you definitely want to keep that in mind and do as much background research on your audience and get to know them as well as you can. And then you want to figure out, where do their values and your story meet? And that's what you want to emphasize in your story. So what do they value? What does that have in common? What does your story have in common with what they value? If I could just speak, that would be helpful, wouldn't it? Okay. Planning your pitch. If you take nothing else away from this, hopefully you will take this one lesson. And that is, there are two most important things. And the number one most important thing is the last thing you say and the last thing you display. So the last thing in your visual aid and the last thing that you say in your pitch. The number two most important thing is the first thing you say and display for your audience. Now, there are a couple of psychological principles at work here. Primacy and recency. Anybody ever have a psychology class where you talk about those things? Primacy and recency. So you're most likely to remember the last thing that you heard or saw. That's why your closing, the very last thing you say and display, is most important. You're second most likely to remember the first thing that you saw or heard. And even better, if you can make those things work together, if you can connect your attention getter to your closing, you create something called psychological unity for your audience. It's a sense of completion, of wholeness. And that can be what absolutely makes them feel like this is a solid idea. Okay, so let's first talk about the second most important thing that you say or display, and that is your opening. You can open with different types of attention-getting devices. You can startle your audience with statistics, with images. You can use quotes. You can arouse curiosity by asking questions of your audience. And, of course, you can tell a brief story, really brief in the attention getter, right? You can tell the beginning of the story, leave off the end, and tell it in your closing. So you start a story about whatever situation it was that was motivated you to develop this idea or this product. You were so frustrated with whatever it was. And then in the closing, you connect back to that and tell the end of the story. Okay. You can also combine more than one of those things. And you can ask a question, use a quote, a statistic, and an image. So combining more than one can make it a super powerful attention getter. Now, the number one most important thing you say is the last thing you say in display. And how many of you have seen this done a lot? Any questions and thank you, the last thing. You see it all over the place. This is the current CEO of Apple. So it's not like no one ever does this. But here's the thing. This is a huge waste of an opportunity because that's the last thing that your audience sees. Does it have anything to do with your idea or your product or whatever it is? You can't tell what that was about, right? If you're looking at the last thing in your visual and you can't tell just by looking at that what that presentation was about, then it's a terrible closing visual. That's what should be behind your head when you're closing. There's really no reason to have thank you or questions in giant letters behind your head. You can say thank you and be polite. I'm not telling you not to be polite. But you want to be sure that there's a meaningful image behind you. You also want to be sure that the last thing you say is something that's meaningful and memorable and leaves an impact on your audience. So your closing needs to have a powerful visual, and it needs to be a meaningful, memorable, impactful call to action, especially for a pitch, a persuasive pitch. All right. Now let's talk about what's going to go in between the first thing you say and the last thing you say. Monroe's motivated sequence. Has anyone had a public speaking class in here? If you didn't have your first year seminar, have you had a public speaking class? Okay, so just one? All right. So Monroe's motivated sequence is a persuasive organizational pattern for speeches. It's been around forever, and it is designed to motivate action in an audience. So it's based on psychological principles to move your audience to actually do something based on your presentation or your speech. So let's look at the steps involved in Monroe's motivated sequence. There are 5 steps, the first one being the hook or the attention getter. Then you can see the last one is the action step, so that would be your call to action. And in between, you have these 3 important steps in Monroe's motivated sequence. The very first thing you do is demonstrate need to your audience. So establish that problem. That's going to be the first main point in the body of your presentation, or your pitch. Then the next main point is going to be the solution, which is your idea, right? So you supply the solution to the demand that you just established in your first main point. And then the third main point is the visualization point. And your visualization point is where you help your audience visualize your solution in action. What a great world it would be if your idea or your product was implemented, adopted, funded. Nancy Duarte's Shape of Great Presentations, as I was watching, and I thought, you know what that reminds me of? Monroe's motivated sequence. So it's pretty interesting how those two are very similar.
Here it is. This is the shape of a great presentation. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end, and I want to walk you through it because the greatest communicators of all time, I went through speeches, everything, actually I can overlay the shape. Even the Gettysburg Address follows the shape. So at the beginning of any presentation, you need to establish what is. You know, here's the status quo, here's what's going on, and then you need to compare that to what could be. Now you need to make that gap as big as possible because there's the commonplace of the status quo, and you need to contrast that with the loftiness of your idea. So it's like, you know, here's the past, here's the present, but look at our future. Here's a problem, but look at that problem removed. Here's a roadblock. Let's annihilate the roadblocks. You need to really amplify that gap. This would be like the inciting incident in a movie. It's when suddenly the audience has to contend with what you just put out there, and they have to say, wow, do I want to agree with this and align with it or not? And then the rest of your presentation should support that. So the middle goes back and forth. It traverses between what is and what could be, what is and what could be. Because what you're trying to do is make the status quo and the normal unappealing. And you're wanting to draw them towards what could be in the future with your idea adopted.
Okay. So let's go back to our Monroes motivated sequence here. And what is, that would be your first main point, right? The demand, establishing the need for your idea or your product. That's your first main point. What could be, that's your solution, the idea that you're there to pitch, right? And then the visualization step, the third main point, is going back and forth between those, contrasting them. What is, what could be, what is, what could be, what is, what could be, right? And then, of course, your closing is a call to action, which is what she terms the new bliss, right? That exists once your idea is adopted. Super effective for motivating people. Let's see what she has.
Here's Mr. Jobs. Completely has changed the world of personal computing. He's changed the music industry. Now he's on his way to change the mobile device industry. So he's definitely changed the world. And this is the shape of his iPhone launch, 2007, when he launched his iPhone. It's a 90-minute talk. You can see he starts with what is, traverses back and forth, and ends with what could be. So I want to zoom in on this. The white line is him speaking. He's just talking. The next color line you'll see popped up there, that's when he cuts to video, so he's adding some variety, and he cuts to demo. So it's not just him talking the whole time. And these lines are representative there. And then towards the end, you'll see a blue line, which will be the guest speaker. So this is where it gets kind of interesting. Every tick mark here is when he made them laugh. And every tick mark here is when he made them clap. They are so involved physically. They are physically reacting to what he is saying, which is actually fantastic, because then you know you have the audience like in your hand. So he kicks off what could be with this as a day I have been looking forward to for 2.5 years. So he's launching a product that he's known about already for a couple years. So this is not a new product to him. But look at this. He does this other thing. He marvels. He marvels at his own product. He marvels himself more than the audience laughs or claps. So he's like, isn't it awesome? Isn't this beautiful? And he's modeling for the audience what he wants them to feel. So he is actually doing a job of compelling them to feel a certain way. So he kicks off with what could be, with every once in a while, a revolutionary product comes along that changes everything. So he starts to kick in and talk about his new product. Now at the beginning of it, he actually keeps the phone off. You'll see that the line is pretty white up until this point. So he goes off between, here's this new phone, and here's the sucky competitors, and here's this new phone, and here's the sucky competitors. And then, right about here, he has a star moment, and that's something we'll always remember. What he does, he turns the phone on. The audience sees scrolling for the first time, and you can hear the oxygen sucked out of the room. They gasped. You can actually hear it. So he creates a moment that they'll always remember. So if we move along this model, you can see the blue where the external speakers are going, and then over towards the bottom right, the line breaks. That's because his clicker broke. So what does he do? He wants to keep this heightened sense of excitement. He tells a personal story right there where the technology didn't work. So here's the master communicator, and he turns to story to keep the audience involved. So the top right, he ends with the new bliss. He leaves them with a promise that Apple will continue to build revolutionary new products. And he says, there's an old Wayne Gretzky quote that I love. I skate to where the puck is going to be, not to where it's been. We've always tried to do that at Apple from the very, very beginning, and we always will. So he ends with the new bliss.
Okay, so you get the idea about Monroe's motivated sequence and how her actually analyzing great speeches and presentations that already existed. What we do sometimes is we look back at those and say, why was that so effective? And that's what she did, and this is what she found. There's one more strategic thing that you need to do, though, and that is you need to establish your credibility. Right after you open, you get their attention with your hook. Now you need to establish credibility with them and give them a reason to listen to you on the topic and connect with them. This is a super important relationship building step in your presentation. Like, for instance, if I had done this, I would have, and I forgot to tell you, I would have told you that I've been teaching public speaking since 1994, basically. Well, you did introduce me though, but you know. And so those kinds of details about my interest in and knowledge and why I have it helps boost my credibility right after you gain attention. The credibility statement should be the easiest thing for you to come up with because it's all about you. It's all about your interest in, your knowledge of, your experience with whatever idea or product it is you're pitching. You want to think about, what have I experienced in this area that I developed my idea to address that my audience has also experienced? And you want to point that out specifically using the words like you. Very effective, because it helps to build that common ground and explicitly connect with your audience about your topic. So now you're giving them a reason to listen to you because they know you know something about it, you've been interested in it for a while, and you have experience with it on some level. That's right after you gain attention. All right? So we've talked about your story, finding your why, being audience-centered, being strategic, including psychological unity, establishing that with your attention getter and your closing, Monroes motivated sequence to pattern the entire pitch, right? The points in the middle especially, and then establishing your credibility. Now we'll talk about being clear and sort of a danger of being clear in a persuasive presentation, and that is psychological reactance. The art of persuasion lies in simplifying something down to its core and communicating to others what they really care about. Super important, right? You have to boil it down and base your remarks on what they really care about. And you do need to be clear in that context. But, warning, you can be too clear in a persuasive presentation. If you tell someone in your thesis what we generally think of as a thesis statement, right? That would normally come after your credibility. If you say, I'm going to convince you or I'm going to persuade you, your audience immediately recoils, basically, in their mind, in their internal dialogue with you as a speaker. Telling someone you're going to change something about them immediately is a good way to get them to say, oh, no, you're not, right? So they will resist. We are programmed to resist being influenced. So you don't have to be that explicit, though, to be clear. You can say, I have an idea that's going to address this situation. You can say it however, whatever your idea or product is, you can address that, but don't say you're going to convince them that it's the best thing on planet Earth, right? Okay, psychological reactance. You don't want to trip that. So you got your hook, your tension getter, your credibility statement, gives them a reason to listen to you, then your thesis, which is just going to be a brief topic teaser. You're not going to go into too much detail yet. The next step of being clear is where you go into a little bit more detail. You give them a roadmap of what you're about to tell them. So whatever it is that you've described in what is your first Monroes motivated sequence main point, and then the second one and the third one. So you have to sort of briefly address what is, could be, and then the visualization step. Just preview it and tell them you're going to take them through this. And then you go through each one. It gives them a pattern to follow. The next step, where being clear becomes really important, is in the summary. So after you have gone through your 3 main points, then you just briefly summarize with what is, what could be, and your visualization. And then the last step, of course, is the new bliss, the closing call to action. So you have a worksheet, hopefully, you all have one, that I put together that actually has all of those steps laid out for you. So you should be able to see them and use them if you wanted to do that.
So after you've moved back and forth between what is and what could be, the last turning point is a call to action, which every presentation should have. But at the very end, you need to describe the world as a new bliss. This is utopia with my idea adopted. This is the way the world is going to look when we join together and we solve this big problem. So you need to use that as your ending in a very poetic and a dramatic way.
Don't forget your call to action, right? That's your final step. That's the super important part. Okay, now delivering your pitch. Your visual aids. You want to think about size, simplicity, and color when you think about what you're going to display. You should try to keep the attention of your judges and the audience up here with you. You don't ever want to pass something around to the judges or the audience while you're speaking. Why wouldn't you want to do that, do you think? Yeah, because then what happens is someone, oh, did you get it? And you're passing it around and you're looking at that, and all of a sudden they've missed one of your most important points to your pitch, right? So you never want to pass anything around until after your closing call to action, and then pass around everything you like to do. You never want to have less than 20-point font. You want to use bold sans serif. You see how hard it is to see the thin lines on that logo and that image in their presentation. You could see on the other side, it's much easier to see. I think you should probably have that in your, if you can't see it up there, you probably have it in your worksheet too. Bold, Arial, or Calibri fonts usually work best in presentations. When you project a presentation, it's always going to wash out the image a little bit, and then when you have thin areas on a font, it makes it very difficult to see. So bold fonts and the simple ones without the serifs, right, the little tails on them, project better. When it comes to color, you want to think about very dark color against a light text and light text against a dark background. So whatever you do, make sure there's a high contrast between any text that's on the slide and the background. Because again, projectors, you're going to wash that out, and if you have high contrast, your slide will still be easy to see and will still look good. Pitch perfect presentation begins with professional appearance. Okay, that's step one, of course. I can see that you all know that already. And movement and immediacy, super important. Being conversational and eye contact. And these two things, conversational and eye contact, go hand in hand. Usually if you are reading, you are not talking to your audience. So you'll have that reading tone of voice and you won't be conversational. Which one of these projects would you invest in if you had the money to invest in it? The beer blizzard or sweet balls? Cake balls. Take some cake balls, yeah. What do you think of their appearance?
Professional, clean.
Aha. Professional, right? They're chefs, so that would make sense that they're dressed in their chef attire, but it's professional looking chef attire, right? These guys, I wouldn't recommend, even if you're pitching a product or an idea like this, I don't recommend dressing like your idea or like your target audience. That's basically what these guys did, was dress like their target audience, because they probably are their target audience, right? But for your pitch, do you think someone would be like totally confident giving these guys their money? I wouldn't think so. What's that? If they give them the beer? Yeah, possibly. I mean, beer's good stuff, but I still think they would be more successful if they were dressed professionally instead of like their target audience. So I would say no on this one, yes on that one. And what about this one? This was a product that was supposed to stop house fires, right? Obviously, these are for shows too, but the thing is, in public speaking class, sometimes students will ask if they are supposed to dress like whatever it is they're talking about, if they're talking about a particular career or something. You're not dressing as a character, right? You want to still dress professionally. I still think that's the way to go. You don't want to dress in character to pitch your idea. You want to dress professionally and look like someone who's worth investing in and who will take good care of their money, right? That's probably the most important thing. Podiums are evil. Even this right here, look, I tend to do this because it's here. This is evil. It's an evil temptation. Also, if you stand behind it, it's just a big barrier between you and your audience. So you need to get out from behind it, and you need to move around and establish immediacy. If there's a podium in the vicinity, step away from the podium if you can. A lot of studies have shown that speakers who get out from behind podiums are rated as more likable and more successful by their audiences. So stay away from evil podiums. All right, and according to Mr. Jobs, once again, great things in business are never done by one person, they're done by a team of people. How many of you think you're going to be presenting as a team? Or no already? Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay, so a number of you. All right, if you present as a team, of course, if it's two people, you're just going to do relay style back and forth, handing off different parts of your presentation. And you could, if you had a team of more than two, let's say up to 5 people, you could just go straight down the line. Each person take a different part of the pitch. But you could also do something more interesting. Like you could start from the inside, just inside, go to the ends, and then end up in the middle to keep it more interesting that way, right? And then if you have one person who's a really strong speaker, have them open, then each other teammate gives their part of the pitch, and then have that same person come back to close. That could also help with generating that psychological unity for your audience, because they opened and then they close it. So a couple of strategies that you might want to keep in mind that could be helpful. All right. Conversational versus reading tone. I actually took these examples out because I was afraid I would run out of time. But the monotone voice, do you guys enjoy a monotone voice? No, it will put you to sleep for a reason, right? Reading tone of voice. Why do we read to children to get them to go to sleep? Usually, reading tone of voice puts people to sleep, and it's very monotone. And when you're reading text, it's impossible virtually to not have reading tone of voice. To try and break students of doing that, we used to do elocution exercises with Dr. Seuss books. It's very hard to read Dr. Seuss and be monotone, but that's one of the only authors really that is conducive to variation in pitch and tone. Presentation notes. You should have presentation notes in front of you because you're going to have a lot of details too, with your TAMs and your SAMs and your SOMs and all the technical things about a business plan, right? But you don't want to be looking at those details. Your slides, your visuals that you develop for your pitch are not your notes. So you don't want every word that you're going to present up there. And you don't want every word that you're going to present on your note cards. The way that you construct note cards, just by writing notes and note cards, by the way, the note card, the thickness of it makes them easier to mess with than paper. Paper can be kind of difficult to fumble with. So note cards, they do still sell them. They're really good things to go and buy. You can buy bigger ones too. And construct them in a specific way where you label the part and you label it prominently in a different color ink so it stands out. So sometimes you can remember what you plan to do for that part just by looking at that, and you don't have to look at your note card any longer. And the act of writing the card out commits the information to memory. Cognitive psychology studies have shown that the act of writing commits information to memory in a way that typing does not. So even studying for a test, I highly recommend writing out like outlines and things. Really helps you remember the material. And it can really help you learn the material for your speech. So label the pitch part, write in brief keywords. Don't put every word on there. Make it so that if you read your note card out loud, just word for word, it wouldn't make sense. So you can't rely on it, and you can't revert to reading. So you just want brief keywords. Also, always number them and make sure it stands out. Different color ink and highlight it. That way you can tell if you skipped something, or if you drop them, it makes a stressful situation less so because you can put them back together very quickly. And then if you have a visual aid, if you're supposed to turn it or do something with it, you want to note that because sometimes people get going giving their presentation or their pitch and they forget. Okay, strategic pauses. The right word may be effective, but no word is ever as effective as a rightly timed pause. You want to be sure you work those in. If you have a tendency when you're presenting to an audience to sort of fly through your material really quickly, note cards can actually help because you can strategically put in a breath in between those, which will force you to pause a little bit. Pauses are important, especially for persuading, because it creates moments for your audience to reflect on your ideas, to process them and understand them more, to build anticipation of what's coming up, and to let your audience experience emotions that you've just hopefully inspired with your presentation or your pitch. Here's what happens to most pauses. We fill them. And our verbal fillers that we have are just habits of ours, and it's natural in conversation, but it kills the impact of a pause. So you want to become comfortable with silence, which most people are not. You feel like you have to fill that silence. So you just want to practice pausing and letting there be some silence. And you can do that, you can practice in the practice room. There's information on your worksheet about it. You can reserve it. It's in the library. It's room 314. And you can take your visual aid. You just have to have 2 USBs. When you go in there, you put your visual aid behind you, right? It'll display that, and then it will video you with your visual aid delivering your presentation. And you can watch yourself. Highly recommend doing this at least once. It's a good-sized room. A team could go in there and practice their presentation in front of their visual aid, using their visual aid. You want to over-practice your introduction and your conclusion. Your introduction, because the anxiety or the nervousness, all the symptoms of that you feel, studies have shown will trail off significantly once you get through those 4 steps in the intro part of your presentation. So if you over-practice your attention getter and your credibility and your thesis and your preview, then you know those extra well, and they just roll right out. Then you get into the body of your speech and those 3 other points, the need, the solution, and the visualization step, and you settle into that, and your physical symptoms of anxiety will be trailing off. Then your conclusion, you want to over-practice that summary and your closing call to action. Because another thing that will sometimes happen is people get excited to be finished with their speech, and then they just quit after their last main point, so they don't ever summarize or close. So you want to be sure that you over-practice those. Okay. So here's someone upon Steve Jobs' passing, thanking him for keeping his eye on where the puck was going. He was remembered for that. He's remembered for that statement, period, but also for actually doing that with his idea and his innovation. And another great quote that he had was, "Innovation distinguishes between a leader and a follower." So I hope that you find him inspiring. And here is hopefully a good example of a Q&A, question and answer slide, where I have reminders up here for you of the things that I just talked about that will help you generate questions. So we talked about your story, your why, being audience-centered, strategic, and clear. We talked about psychological unity, credibility, psychological reactance, Monroes motivated sequence, and finally, delivering your pitch. What questions do you have? Thanks, I appreciate it. What questions do you have? Yeah.
So once you hit your summary, is it okay to say like, and to summarize?
Yeah, sure, yeah, absolutely. You know why? Because that statement alone can get your audience's attention back if they're gone. Because they're like, oh, they're finishing up. So that's an excellent point. I actually should have included that in here. Good. Yeah. What else? Those transition words are super important for helping people follow your presentation. So you can say first and foremost, second, third when you're in the body, in your main points. Yeah.
Can you give some basic something by demonstrating need?
By demonstrating need?
Right from the start?
Sure, yeah, touch on that for sure. That's definitely going to be a big part of the emotion probably of the speech and the why, I would say. So it's going to be woven throughout. It's just you need to thoroughly demonstrate it in that first main point. That's where you'll probably have your statistics about, you know, the market, target market available and what you are going after. That's where you'll get specific about it. But yeah, that's demonstrating that need from the start. Good idea. Definitely. Thank you.